So in this video, I want to go over some numbers from some other parts of the world. And I think some students may find this interesting. So we have Vietnam, China, South Korea, Japan, and India. So I just kind of picked some well-known countries from Asia. And so we kind of have three different patterns going on here. We don't have one pattern. So we kind of have three different patterns. So one pattern was that countries with a couple of countries, a handful of countries who had a state-planned economy and also had the socialism, kind of a local version of socialism going on, tended to have very high labor force participation rates for women. Just to put these numbers in perspective, so Vietnam and China were both in the low 70s. This is back in the 1990s. And at that time, the U.S. was about 58 or 59%. Okay, so there's a pretty big difference. So these are high numbers, right? And they tend to be very high, and they had been very high since at least the 1980s, maybe even the 1970s in the case of China. And for Vietnam, they had been very high since at least back to the 1980s. And this is partly because the government took a role to sort of break down gender barriers and bring women into the workforce, partly because this was seen as like a national project to produce more. Incidentally, in many ways, the economic development of Vietnam kind of mirrors China, except for it started later. So Vietnam's kind of at a little bit of a different stage than China's economic development is, but some parts of the process kind of mirror each other. So anyway, since around 2000, the labor force participation for women in China has started to fall. And we'll get into some of this next week for the US, but part of this is pretty innocuous. So part of this is things like staying longer in school. So as more and more women are going to college, then there's women are starting their first job later, and this is lowering their labor force participation, because for younger women, these numbers are going down. Part of this is prosperity. So it's going down, but it's still relatively high. It's still a little bit higher than the US. Even at the ending point, it gets down to about 60. Part of this is prosperity. Families can afford to have somebody stay home during key times. Women can afford to retire. So part of this is prosperity happening. The numbers for Vietnam, at least the ones I could find, are still relatively high, but I would not be surprised at all if this number for Vietnam starts to fall in the near future. Okay, so then what else is happening here? Well, let's go down to India, because it's the extreme case. So India had a very low labor force participation and really conservative social norms related to women working outside of their homes. And this has actually been going down, okay? So this is kind of the left side of that U-shaped labor force participation. So you can consider China and Vietnam not following the pattern at all, okay? Totally different pattern, partly because of the influence of government in the decision-making about the labor force. India is kind of, in some ways, is like kind of the left side of the middle, in that as India has developed and the economy has grown, actually labor force participation for women has fallen. And this is still a little bit of a puzzle. Somebody might want to research about this in their research, okay? So that might be pretty interesting. I'm going to take India off of here before I talk about Japan and there we go. Now things will be a little more clear because things are more spread out. Okay, before I talk about Japan and Korea. So Japan and Korea were pretty low. So by world standards, their labor force participation rates were low. So we're talking 50 and like 47 back in 1990. And remember, at that time, the US was pushing close to 60, like I think about 56%, if I remember off the top of my head. So this is pretty low numbers. And they didn't do much throughout this time. But since about 2010, both of them have started to rise, and now they're up to like 52 and I don't know what the number is for Japan, 52, 53 respectively. Okay, so these numbers actually aren't that, the US, remember, is somewhere in between the China numbers and these. So the US is about 58, 59. And so these numbers are right there. So so basically this is starting to change. So Korea and Japan had very low labor force participation for women, and now this is starting to change. I guess that's the message, the best message I can say here. Okay, so we have kind of three patterns going on. We have the pattern of Vietnam and China. We have the pattern of the countries which had traditionally relatively low labor force participation, but really good economic development. And now they seem to be starting to change, starting to increase. And then we have the pattern going on in South Asia, where it seems like social norms seem to be dominating the pattern. Okay, and so that remains to be seen what will happen there. Coming into Europe, okay, so this video is going to look at Europe. We have Sweden has been high and rising, but we find UK rising, Germany rising, France slowly rising, okay, and Italy low but rising. So all of these countries actually are following a little different pattern than the US, because again, remember the US rose until about 2000 and then was kind of stagnant for about a decade and then started to fall, right? So all these countries in Europe, even the ones that had a lower number, because most of them had a lower number than the US, the difference in their pattern is that as the US goes starting to go down in this area, they are continuing to go up. There's a little bit of debate about what's going on here, but one of the things has to do with that the policies in most European countries, not all, for example, in Italy, there's like quite a bit of labor market discrimination, and that's part of the reason for this low labor force participation rate. But in many of the countries, the policies for the workplaces tend to be a lot more family friendly. There's more flexible options, more part-time options, and so that's part of the reason why these numbers have been able to keep increasing. The US has less of these options, especially in professional careers. But at the same time, there's also a debate about whether these flexible options in the end up lowering the kind of career attainment for women who are in the workplace because they kind of get put into this sidetrack. So anyways, I just kind of put this out here for your information, but this also might prompt somebody who wants to go look at what's going on in another country.